Social Constitution in the Form of the Capitalist State by Werner Bonefeld. I want to preface this before I end this because this is a little bit more academic. Literally, that's not a pejorative. I mean, it's literally an academic paper. But this paper, the introduction in the first part, it goes over debates on the state that appeared within Marxism over the last, few decades, basically. And he lays out different positions. And then he lays out his own position, which seems to be very rooted in class struggle. It's a very, very good paper. I didn't know what to expect going in, but it blew me away, like halfway in. I was like, I need to read this. I wanted to hear this paper. Introduction. After the slowdown of the state derivation debate at the end of the 1970s, interest in the state arose again with the conservative shift to power in almost all Western capitalist countries at the beginning of the 1980s. Recent work on the capitalist state has been influenced by the debate on post-Fordism. The discussion of the post-Fordist state aims at a more concrete conceptualization of the state in order to come to grips with changes in the relation between the state and the economy. The key issue for those participating has not been to reject the state derivation debate, but to subsume it into a theory of capitalist development. In this way, the perennial theme of Marx's controversy, that is, the relation between structure-struggle, is discussed more concretely in the context of contemporary developments. I've argued elsewhere that the crucial weakness of the debate on post-Fordism is the disarticulation of structure and struggle. This weakness already existed in Hirsch's contribution to the state derivation debate. The problematic issue of the relation between structure and struggle is the central question for any attempt to understand capitalism. In this paper, I intend to carry forward the discussion opened by my assessment of the debate on the post-Fordist state by examining some of the conceptual questions regarding the issue of structure and process in relation to the capitalist state. I shall argue that struggle should be seen as a mode of existence of class antagonism, and hence, as a result, the premise of class struggle. The following is the order of presentation. The section on struggle and structure and struggle in debates on the state introduces briefly the problem as it occurred in Hirsch's contribution to the state derivation debate. This section includes also a brief presentation of structural Marxism, which proved influential in the debate on post-Fordism. There then follows a presentation on the capitalist state as mode of existence of class antagonism in capitalist society. This section is divided into two subsections, social form and substantive abstraction of the state. The first subsection looks at the constitution of Marxist categories, and the second discusses the constitution in relation to the state. The conclusion sums up the argument and confronts its findings with the debate introduced below. 1. Structure and struggle in the debate on the state. Hirsch's derivation of the state aimed at understanding the state in terms of the capitalist relations of production. What, according to Hirsch, constitutes the state as a capitalist phenomenon is the separation of the collective social organization from society itself, an abstraction which posits the state as an external force of society, subjugating rulers and ruled alike to a form of domination and social organization independent from them. Well, that just totally erases class struggle if everyone, including the state's actors, are oppressed by the state equally. This separation is understood as a mode of existence and mode of motion of social relations. The state is understood as a form of the class relation of capital and labor. In the event, Hirsch's approach to the state made it possible to see the historical existence of the capitalist state as a process, the historical form of which is a concrete reality of class antagonism. Although Hirsch's reasoning implies the relation between structure and class antagonism is not external, but rather a historical process, or a dialectical relation, between object, historical result of class struggle, and subject, class struggle conditioned by and transcending its own historical premise, he failed to follow through this interrelation between structure and struggle. The potentiality of Hirsch's emphasis on the importance of class struggle is the historical development of the state remained undeveloped. The course of capitalist development is not determined mechanically or by some kind of law of nature. Within the framework of its general law, capitalist development is determined rather by the action of acting subjects and classes. The resulting concrete conditions of crisis and their political consequence, the tension between the objective law and struggle lies in the framework objective laws of capitalist development, is juxtaposed to class struggle, and the disarticulation of class struggle from objective laws in the framework of subordinate class struggle as a motor of history to a predetermined, objectively given development of capital. This dualism is clearly expressed in Hirsch's treatment of the development of state functions. Hirsch's dualist view of structure and struggle is reminiscent of Poulan's. The main thrust in Poulan's contribution to state theory relates to the conceptualization of the state as a level that is relatively autonomous from the economic. As Holloway/Piccolotto put it, the conceptual discussion in Capital is seen in Poulan's as confined to theorizing the economic level. A theory of capitalist state has hints to develop new concepts for the political level, such as hegemony, political, class character. The aim of this approach was to identify the structural adequacy of the political in relation to the economic. Structural adequacy concerned the existence of the state as a relatively autonomous entity vis-a-vis the economic. This understanding is grounded on the base superstructure metaphor. The question of the inner nature of the relation of capital and labor within diverse social and political phenomena was reduced merely to a question of the historical cohesion of different structures. The condensing and the homogenization of different structures was seen as achieved by the hegemonic fraction of capital. The state was seen as the global factor of cohesion. Class struggle played an important role, but secondary role, determining the development and particular configuration of the structure of the state in a historically specific conjuncture. The systemic existence of the relative autonomous entity followed objectively given laws of development. The class struggle was seen as subaltern to the structural configuration of capitalism. Poulan's problem was to combine in a systemic way what, following Marx's writing, belongs together: the theorizing of internalized systemic existence of separate structures, and the attempt to introduce a social process which develops these structures, relates them to each other, and mediates their transformation. Jessup's contribution to the dialectic between structure and struggle attempts to build on and to develop Poulan's approach in response to its critics. Building on Poulan's, Jessup argues for a conjunctural or relational approach to the relation between the political and the economic, equating, in its most extreme version, not only struggle with strategy, but class struggle with capital strategies. In order to overcome the problem of determinate structures in Poulan's, Jessup proposes a theory of structural coupling or a theory of articulation. The former relates to the system theoretical analysis as developed by Luhmann. The latter is said to be a Marxist version of similar analysis which, however, avoids the cul-de-sac of the former. If this is all confusing and you don't know who any of these people are or what they're talking about, don't fret. At the end of this section, I basically did a summary of all their theories. I just looked them up independently to give you all context. For Jessup, the task of understanding the political system is that of theorizing, without falling into functionalism. The non-necessary correspondence between the political and the economic. Hence Jessup's concern with a relational approach to the state. The relational approach to the state is said to provide insight into sui generis operation of different social subsystems, even though they were not and could not be completely insulated from their environment, and in many respects depend on it. The term charged with the task of translating this into scientific practicability, is the mode of articulation. A mode of articulation is said to permit a concentration of the political, economic, and ideological systems in historical concrete situations, unifying these three systems into a historically specific conjuncture in determinate forms. The mechanism through which the different systems are integrated into a corresponding and complementary mode of articulation is a hegemonic project of capital. The segmented parts of the social body have no unity until they are coordinated into a project by somehow hidden agency of condensation. Jessup seems to imply that a successful hegemonic project leads to results which correspond to the needs of a specific shape of economic development. Since the political sphere is seen as providing through its self-determined and close operation outputs corresponding to the needs of the economic system, the precise historical working of this correspondence relates to strategic forces that promote hegemonic practices, which melt the different institutional spheres together. This would seem to be a functionalist and voluntarist view of capitalist reproduction. Yeah, I mean, that's almost a conspiracy theory, understanding the state ultimately. Like how these state actors just get together, basically, and then plan shit out. I don't really think it works in such a voluntaristic manner. There is a level of voluntarism to it, but there's also a level of... it's also automatic to an extent, though. I mean, you have to meet it between both. I think he overcorrects, basically, Poulantz's in the other guy. Justice seeks a structuralist understanding of Marx's phrase concerning the existence of the abstract and the concrete and vice versa. The structuralist version of this relation involves the introduction of the intermediate concepts, seen as a mechanism that combines the abstract and the concrete. Abstract unity and the centralized laws of motion and the need for capital constructed by capital logicians are combined into a series of more concrete, competing, and contingent logics of capital. Hence the charge against structuralism of positing essentialized laws of motion. Hence also the charge of voluntarism in terms of the structuration of hegemonic interest, aiming at capturing the state and shaping historically specific mode of articulation. The deficiencies of the conception of structuralist relation are to be overcome by combining them with the explication of reactive and reflexive patterns of behavior of different capital logics that follow. In a subjective faction, the impulses given by the development of objective laws of capitalist development. As a consequence, capital no longer exists as class struggle pervading social reality as a whole. Instead, social reality is seen as determined by multiple causes and effects. Yeah, it's almost like the big other in Lacan. It just makes an entirely unfalsifiable reality, the integration of which is ensured by the imposition of a dominant hegemonic logic of capital, a logic derived from the interest-based struggle of one capital logic against another within determined forms of structural development. While Poulantzas referred to the class struggle as mediating and unfolding of the objective laws of capitalist development, Jessup sees the mechanism of social practice in terms of individualized and pluralist allocation of interest of different capital logicians. The resulting eclecticism construes the fragmentation of different phenomena as a causal relation. In the debate on the post-Fordist state, in which Hirsch and Jessup are the main proponents, the unresolved tension between structure and process is discussed in terms of Jessup's understanding of the dialectic between structure and process. The assumption of corresponding and hence functional relation between mode of articulation and regulative forms of state theories, crises as a structural dysfunctionality, and the disintegration of mode of articulation. The prevailing notion of a crisis as an objectively given unfolding of the law of capitalist development transforms into the notion of objectively given recovery, that is, the recoupling of structural regularity and correspondence in a different historical form, such as post-Fordism. Within the framework of an emerging reconstruction of the role of the state vis-a-vis the social, the class struggle is seen as playing a subordinate role, merely accelerating or retarding an inevitable transformation of social reality. Basic is the struggle between different capital strategies and their attempt to capture the state within a structurally predetermined development, making the recoupling of a mode of articulation a contingent process. The disarticulation of structure and class struggle entails a descriptive and suggestive understanding of social development that can only identify static structures and is forced to pose a qualitative change as a sudden discontinuity, a quantum leap between structures, for example, the leap from Fordism to post-Fordism, and not as a process, a qualitatively changing continuum in and through the class struggle. In appraisal. Contrary to these approaches to the state, I want to show that the structures are modes of existence of the class antagonism, capital, and labor. The law of capitalist development are nothing else than the movement of the class struggle. The law of capitalist development are an abstraction in action, in historical reality, a process in the movement of the presence of labor within capital. Rejecting the disarticulation of structure and process does not mean rejecting and understanding the state as performing a particular role in capitalist social reproduction. However, the role performed by the capitalist state will be discussed here as determined by its social form. and as a historical process of the class struggle. Instead of the apparent autonomy of the state, however relative it may be, and however much it seems to justify a particular degree of relativity, the political and economic will be discussed as a constituting a contradictory unity. This unity does not exist as a monolithic block, but as a movement of contradiction in which the unity manifests itself through difference and vice versa. The fragmentation of the economic and political, as well as the historical composition of the interrelation, is only real as a process of class struggle. Okay, and now, for the benefit of everyone, I'm going to just go over in brief what the three people he mentioned are about, because, yeah, it's a little out of context if you don't have any precedents. So, for Hirsch, the economy is kind of the engine, while the state is the steering wheel. And he argues that the state is derived from the needs of capital, and its primary feature is its separation from society, where it appears in an external force that keeps order so the market can function. He's sort of halfway correct, but he sees the state as a form of class relation, but he traps class struggle within the framework of economic laws and kind of has the state as this thing that oversees society totally separate from it. Also, a kind of weird consequences, then there becomes no meaningful difference between capitalism in itself and state capitalism, which I think is actually a meaningful difference. So for Poulantzas, that's the guy who postulates relative autonomy of the state. I should preface that actually that was my understanding of how it operated. I've never read Poulantzas though. Now, but he might mean something different by it. But my understanding from reading Marx is that the state has some level of authority over the capitalist class, but because it has to mediate their interest, but at the same time, its power derives from them. So that was my understanding. I think that's what Poulantzas talks about, because I read a paper on him, a long time, a while ago. But yeah, but anyways, he pauses, he agrees the state isn't just a puppet for the rich, but has its own logic and institutions to manage cohesion between different parts of society. But in doing so, he consequently treats the economic and political spheres as if they're two separate buildings connected by this sort of hallway, and this makes class struggle secondary to the rigid structure of the system. Yeah, I think that's technically true. I mean, I guess that's basically the view I had, but yeah, that probably just missed nuance. I'm coming to learn that a lot of this stuff, it's dialectical. I'm finally understanding, what that really means. Jessup tries to fix Poulantzas by adding strategy terms like structural coupling and hegemonic projects. You probably heard that mentioned there. And he argues the state doesn't have a prefix nature, but a strategic terrain of the different kinds of groups trying to capture and articulate together. But this is an eclectic a voluntarist understanding that kind of makes things like a conspiracy to basically run the economy and society, consciously, and that ignores the inner nature of class struggle. Something of all this that's a little perplexing to me, honestly, and sort of disheartening, is it feels like most of academic Marxism ultimately involves taking Marx's premises and overemphasizing one specific part of it erroneously, and basically making that one specific erroneous thing you're doing your whole career. There's so many examples of this. I can give Poulantzas as an example, because I read a thing on his later state theory, basically, and basically he spent his whole career with this very structuralist Althusserian thing, but then he basically libbed out and he joined some democratic socialist party in Greece, I think, and then he just goes back basically to the Marxist theory, and it's I mean. And Althusser, I think, is the same thing. I don't know. There might be some nuance I'm missing, but I don't really want to read Althusser, so I'm never going to get this nuance. But it's wasn't this whole thing about this, Marx-Hegel distinction, difference, breakaway, epistemic split, divide, and then later in his career, he's just actually, I was wrong. But his people still call that. I don't know. That just literally feels like 90% of academic Marxism. It has no value. Literally none. It's literally just taking Marx, focusing on one thing, and at best it just gives people something to think about, basically. But anyways, 2. Form and content of the capitalist state, social form and a difference in unity of the political and the economic. Following Marx, the social phenomena around us have manifold determinations. The task is to trace out the inner connection between social phenomena so as to establish the inner nature of their relation. To trace out the inner connection between social phenomena is to search for the substantive abstraction which constitutes their social reality as interconnected, as complex forms different from, but united to, each other, in order to theorize this interconnection. The theoretical approach has to specify the historical process which constitutes the common element that makes social phenomena different from, but united to, each other. In order to theorize this interconnection, the theoretical approach has to specify the historical process which constitutes the common element that makes social phenomena different from each other in unity. The attempt to understand the inner nature of social existence relates to a way of thinking which moves within the object of its thinking. Dialectics does not proceed to its object from the outside, but inside, as it attempts to appropriate conceptually social reality in its proper motion. Dialectical thinking conceptualizes itself within and as a moment of its object. Such a conceptualization of social existence seeks an understanding of the apparently isolated facts of life, as compromising a mode of existence of social relations, while in the completed bourgeois system, every economic relation presupposes every other in its bourgeois economic form, and everything posited is thus also a presupposition. That is the case with every organic system. The organic system itself, as a totality, has its presuppositions, and its development to its totality consists precisely in subordinating all developing to itself, or in creating out of its organs which it still lacks. This is historically how it becomes a totality. This is the process of becoming this totality forms a moment of its process of its development. Such a reasoning implies an internal relation between conceptual and historical analysis. Every phenomena exists only in relation to other phenomena, or not. That's a good line. Or in other words, exists only in and through other phenomena. Every phenomena exists only as a movement of contradiction. Finally, someone says it. This is as a moment of its own historical constitution. Don't let a Hegelian hear that. Hence the question of determinate negation, or social form of human relations. What constitutes the relation which makes it possible for phenomena to exist side by side in an apparently independent manner, but nevertheless through each other? What is the historical determination which constitutes them in a relation of mutual dependence and determinate negation, a relation which makes it an independent existence for each impossible? Hence, the economic and political, although seemingly existing independently from each other, stand to each other as the moments of one process. This understanding raises the question of the social relation, which suffuses their existence qua contradiction within their respective forms in a relation to each other. According to this argument, diverse phenomena, such as the state and the economy, do not exist as externally related entities, one of which is determining and or dominating the other, but as forms of existence of the relation which constitutes them. The question arising here concerns the substantive abstraction that makes particular forms, for example the political and economic, different from each other, and which at the same time unites them and hence relates them to each other as complementary forms of social existence. Substantive abstraction is thus the inner nature of social phenomena themselves, their constitution and process. And Marx the substantive relation which constitutes the relation between things as a contradictory relation of historical specificity and which bathes all social phenomena in a certain historical form of existence in bourgeois society is the social relations of production, that is, the class antagonism between capital and labor. Social phenomena are thus constituted as modes of existence/motion in and through which class antagonism exists. This argument will be taken up in less abstract terms below. Now pay attention here, these next 3 paragraphs are fire. I'm going to put a summary of them in the description of this video since they were one of the best things I read in this. Marx's starting point is the social determination of labor. Labor was seen by Marx as the living form giving fire. Its transitoriness of things, their temporality, as their formation by living time. This general determination of labor needs to be specified in its historically concrete form. By conceptualizing the indifferent as to the determined, labor's fluidity to the social form of fluidity of labor, and from the formless, general fluidity of labor to the formal, historical and social specific form of fluidity, Marx understood labor in capitalist society as specified by abstract labor, universal ability and capacity to work, homogeneous labor, in and through the particular social context of surplus value production under the command of capital exploitation. The historical specificity of the determining power of labor in capitalism concerns the contradictory unity of exchange and production. That is, the exchange of commodities through which private labor is reduced to its common substance as abstract labor. The social determination of labor as abstract labor, as social labor in the private context, determines capital as self-valorizing value in terms of expanding abstract wealth by increasing the appropriation of somebody else's labor. That is, the imposition of work in the measurement of the product of labor in terms of money. The capitalist mode of production is not distinguished by the existence of surplus labor or abstract labor or the value form, but the integration of the value form with abstract labor as the substance of value and of the labor process with the valorization of capital as the appropriation and distribution of surplus labor is achieved through the exchange of commodities in the form of money. Money attains generality as the most elementary form of the capitalist imposition of the value form over the conditions of life and as the supreme power in and through which social reproduction is subordinated to the reproduction of capital. Hence the treatment of money as presupposition, premise, and result of the social process of capital, integrating value and money theory as moments which presuppose and which are the result of each other. A category of abstract labor attains generality in capitalist society as command over labor with the circuit of capital as a whole. The social relation which constitutes this determination of labor in capitalist society is the relation between necessary labor and surplus labor. That is, class antagonism of capital and labor, which constitutes the social working day. The determining power of labor appears as the power of capital to set labor in motion. However, the determining power of capital exists only and through labor as substance of value. The constituting power of the working class inverts into power of capital insofar as capital is able to contain labor as a moment of its own social existence. The power of capital is hence a historically specific form of social command that appropriates the determining power of labor as a moment within the process of capital as self-valorizing value. That was fire. And we can all move away from value form theory and also substance form theory now. The social antagonism of capital and labor is a relation of classes, and as a relation of classes, a relation in and against the domination and exploitation, or in other words, a relation in and against the inversion of the determining power of labor into a property of capitalist power to impose the value form over the conditions of life. This inversion is the commanding power of capital that brings together and sets in motion means of production and labor power, a commanding power based on capital's ability to constitute the determining power of labor as a moment of capital's own existence, self-valorization of value through the expanded surplus value production. The relation of classes manifests itself as a contradictory movement between objectification, however alien in form as the social reality of reproduction, and revolutionary separation as a relation between ruled and rulers. The contradiction is expressed in terms of the antagonism as mutual dependence of opposing classes, social forms of reproduction and objectification in and through exploitation and domination, the contradictory character of oppression as indicated by the unity of the production process as labor and valorization process is a substantive one, as capital exists only in and through labor. Hence objectivity, social reproduction as domination, in the position of work as valorization of capital. There is no movement outside social antagonism. Social existence is constituted as a movement of contradiction in and through the presence of labor within capital. The working class, for its part, is a movement of this same process of contradiction. The working class exists in and against capital, while capital, however, exists only in and through labor. The contradictory existence of the working class is manifest in its antithesis to capital's command and its existence of a moment of social reproduction in the form of capital. Labor as opposite to capital and as a moment of the latter's existence. Class is not a group of people to whom the sociologists assign particular characteristics which, in turn, allows social pigeonholing in terms of ascribed class character. Rather, class needs to be approached as a relation of struggle, in and against domination, that denies social self-determination. As a relation of struggle, class's substantive abstraction of social reality in action attains a contradictory existence as the movement of transcendence. Revolution as process in and against capital in terms of the working class self-determination and integration. Reformism in terms of labor as a movement of social reproduction in the form of capital. Transcendence and integration do not exist separately, but as the movement of one process, extreme poles of a dialectical continuum that social practice represents. As extreme poles of a dialectical continuum, transcendence and integration constitutes a contradictory process that is open to the process of struggle itself and as such open to the social composition of class. It is the historical development of the contradictory unity of the relation between social reproduction as domination in and through class, which constitutes society in terms of a continuous displacement of a reconstitution of the enchanted and perverted world of capitalism. The process is informed by the self-contradictory mode of existence of capital, that is, by the continuous need for capital to revolutionize the relation between necessary and surplus labor in order to increase the latter. However, surplus labor exists only in antithesis to necessary labor. It is here that capital's self-contradictory mode of existence becomes manifest in its most condensed terms. Capital depends entirely on a living labor as a substance of value and hence surplus value. The working through this antagonistic tendency compels capital towards the elimination of necessary labor, which undermines the existence of capital as existing only in and through labor. Capital cannot autonomize itself from living labor. The only autonomization possible is on labor's side. Capital's domination is a process of its own self-contradictory mode of existence. The social mediation is contradiction, a mediation which does not sweep away the contradiction itself, but rather provides a modus vivendi in and through which the contradiction can move temporarily, constitutes a form of social reality in which the class contradiction between capital and labor is manifested in terms of market relations. This organization of labor entails a constitution of labor in the form of wage labor, defined primarily by the resource of its income and as an equal and free exchange relation to the market. Labor assumes an existence in terms of wage labor, an existence on which exploitation rests, that is, value form as formally free in equal exchange of commodities, while at the same time eliminates the specific character of surplus value production, exploitation. The attempt to confine living labor to wage labor entails the disorganization of labor's existence as class, harnessing living labor as a moment of capital. The attempt to disorganize labor's revolutionary autonomization from capital and to organize labor as social reality and through valorization, rather than being an accomplished fact, is a process of contradiction, in and through the class struggle itself. Hence, displacement and constitution need to be seen as moments of one process, in which each moment presupposes the other, while each moment is at the same time the result of the other's unity as contradiction. Understanding class antagonism as a movement of contradiction between dependence and separation and conceptualizing social phenomena as a mode of existence and mode of motion of class antagonism, it follows that the contradiction inherent in social form is at the same time a contradiction within social phenomena, as for example the self-contradictory form of the state, and between social phenomena, as for example between the economic and political. It is for this reason that Marxism is neither a theory of oppression over domination nor an economic theory, but a theory of the contradictions of social reality, and as such a theory of the historical movement of the contradiction of domination. I shall refer to the social relations of production in terms of the presence of labor within capital, because the latter expresses the meaning of the former in a more explicit way. In order to understand the form of the state, the notion of substantive abstraction needs to be characterized more strongly. I argue above that every social phenomena is placed as a presupposition and premise of each other, as a mode of existence and mode of motion, of the historical process of the presence of labor within capital. Substantive abstraction seeks to an understanding of the society's concrete existence and development. Substantive abstraction is not to be understood as the empirical abstraction criticized by Marx in abstract materialism. It is in reality much easier to discover by analysis the earthly core of the mystical creations of religion than conversely it is to develop from the actual relations of life the corresponding celestialized form of these relations. The latter method is only materialist and therefore only the only scientific one. The weak point in the abstract materialism of natural science, a materialism which excludes history and its process, are at once evident from the abstract and ideological conception of its spokesmen whenever they venture between the bounds of their own speciality. Contrary to empirical abstraction, to abstract substantiality, it is to trace out the interconnection of social phenomena, an interconnection which constitutes social phenomena and their relation to each other as modes of existence of this very interconnection. The presence of labor within the concept of capital, whereas empiricist abstraction aims at grounding things by identifying their common essence, substantive abstraction attempts to understand essence as the interrelation between things, which is constitutive of those things themselves. In addition, substantive abstraction, unlike empiricist abstraction, exists in through practice, as through forms of social relation, and not just in theory by which the abstraction is made. Hence, the working of substantive abstraction constitutes an abstraction of and as opposed to an abstraction from social reality, an abstraction which exists as concrete in practice through inasmuch social reality and as its process. Social form has no existence separate from concrete historical development, as for example, just as understanding of determinate form, to which more practical terms have to be added, seems to suggest. For Marx, social antagonism can by itself have no existence. Antagonistic relations express themselves always in forms. Value form, money form, form of the state. Form is seen here as the modus vivendi of antagonist relations, and as such, form is generally the way in which contradictions are reconciled. The term mediation is of vital importance here, since it connotates the mode of existence of a dynamic relation of antagonism which allows antagonistic relations to exist side by side. The existence of social antagonism in forms does not seep away. The inconsistencies of antagonist relations, rather, these forms, constitute the existence of this relation, a constitution which exists historically and has to be analyzed in an historical fashion. However, as noted by Psychopedis, the point of the mediation of abstract and concrete is to show that the abstract category of labor presupposes capitalist society. That is, the abstract element in the notion of labor presupposes the real abstraction of labor sans phrase in the society. Hence, the interrelation of the logic and historical, as a rule, the most general abstraction arise only in the midst of the richest possible concrete development, where one thing appears as common to many, to all. Then it ceases to be thinkable in particular form alone. Substantive abstraction is a methodic assertion that one cannot found the categorical beginning naively with the real or the concrete, but only on the basis of the development of the process and synthesis of the givens of intuition and representation. This method of theorizing works within the proper motion of its object, which it has to keep in mind as the presupposition. Conceptualizing social reality in this way opens up the idea of the world as nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into the forms of thought. Substantive abstraction seeks to understand an understanding of the forms of the constitution and the movement of the self-contradictory reconciliation of the capital-labor antagonism that constitutes social reality as a whole. It follows that the primacy of class antagonism is logical and at the same time an historical presupposition. The social relation between capital and labor is a historical presupposition because the foundation of this relation is the historical struggle which led to the separation of the masses of the population from the means of production and subsistence during the process of primitive accumulation. The separation of the laborers from the means of production had to be accomplished historically before capital could constitute itself as the social formation determined by the conditions of life. The capitalist mode of exploitation and mode of domination rest on this historical presupposition, and at the same time, the historical presupposition of the separation of the mass of the population from the means of production and subsistence has to be reproduced during the development of capitalism as a sine qua non of the existence of capital. The historical result of the class struggle during the primitive accumulation inverts in the historical presupposition and serves as premise and precondition for the historical existence of the class antagonism between capital and labor, a premise which has to be reproduced in the motion of capitalist reproduction if the social form of capitalist domination is to continue. From the standpoint of accomplished capitalism, the conceptual approach is bound up with the historical reality of the process of capitalist social historical existence within its proper motion. This process is determined by the substantive abstraction that illuminates social reality as a mode of existence of the class antagonism of capital and labor. In turn, this class antagonism was itself the result of the historical processes which led to capitalist forms of social reproduction. Hence, the result, capitalist social relations, presupposes historical generation, which in turn has to be continually reproduced through the operation of the historical process of capitalism. The latter serves now as a historical result, but as a conceptual and historical presupposition. The historical presupposition attains generality from the standpoint of accomplished capitalism in an inverted form. It would be wrong to let the conceptualization of the forms follow one another, in the same sequence as that in which they were historically decisive. This sequence is determined rather by the interrelation to one another in the mode of bourgeois society, which is precisely the opposite of that which seems to be their natural order, or which corresponds to historical development. The presence of labor within capitalism as the historical result of primitive accumulation inverts into the historical and conceptual presuppositions of the social reality of capitalism. The political, as will be discussed below, inverts the historical process of bourgeois revolution to a historical form determined within the context of the category of the abstract labor, namely social form of reproduction as domination. The development of capitalist domination fosters a process of displacement and constitution of the contradictory unity of class antagonism, as every set of forms provides a mode of existence in which the antagonism of capital and labor can move. The contradiction exists of abstract labor as a social form of wealth founded on exploitation pushes each mediation on the contradictory existence of surplus value production to its point of supersession, resulting in a new set of contradictions. Hence, the displacement of production towards the state and towards a world market as the most developed mode of existence of abstract labor. In sum, the foundation of the social relation of capital and labor, as argued by Clark, lies outside the economic of the state in the state's simpliciter. Or, more precisely, the foundation lies just outside the economic in the state, but rather it suffuses the circuit of capital as social reality. Having said this, it follows that it is the concept of class relation as being prior to the political, economic, and ideological forms taken by those relations, even though class relations have no existence independent of those forms. That makes it possible for a Marxist analysis to conceptualize the complexity of the relations between economic and political. Their interconnection is complementary forms of the fundamental class relation without abandoning the theory for a pragmatic pluralism. It follows that political and economic relations imply different modes of motion of the fundamental class antagonism of capital and labor. Lastly, as a related class antagonism, bourgeois society exists only as a movement of contradiction, the development of the contradiction being determined by the outcome of the class struggle. What is the social context within which the proper motion of the category and of abstract labor attains generality as mode of domination of the capitalist form of social reproduction? Capitalist reproduction is social reproduction in inverted form, private production in a social context. Since the sociality of private production is not a matter of the conscious decision of society, and since the latter exists only in the inverted form of private fragmentation, or commodity production, the sociality of private production confronts individual producers as an external and independent process, which is argued by Marx is their condition of existence as private individuals in a social context. Hence, labor as substance of human existence in a specific social form. The existence of labor as homogeneous and quantitatively ability to work assumes social quality, or social form as abstract labor confronting individual producers as commodities, as social power within the circuit of social capital. The most general abstraction attains practicality, existing generality as production of abstract labor, that is, value. Capitalist production is not use value production, but value production, which in turn is surplus value production, and not only surplus value production, but social reproduction of the social relation of production. In the social process of value, productive commodity and money capital are forms taken by capital value in its self-contradictory process of self-valorization. The circuit of social capital exists only as mediation of the restless appropriation of labor. If we take all three forms, money, commodity, productive capital, together, then all the premises of the process appear as its result, as premises produced by the process itself. This is what Marx is talking about in Capital. Each movement appears as a point of departure or transit of return. The total process presents itself as the unity of the process of production and the process of circulation. The production process is the mediator of the circulation process and vice versa. Thus, the movement of every particular capital is itself only a particular movement of the generality of its form. Value can only be grasped as a movement and not as a static thing. Considering the movement of value as a mere abstraction is to forge that movement of industrial capital in its abstraction and action. The different forms of value relate differently to labor as the substance of value and as means of valorization in the process of exploitation. The motion of value exists therefore in the form of a dialectical continuum as production, sans phrase, objection of capital and machinery, and hence is immobilized, at the same time as mobility, sans phrase, value in the form of money as social incarnation of abstract wealth. This dialectical continuum exists as a process of contradiction within which different forms of value coexist and within which particular capitals transform in a successive moment from one to the other value form. Seeing productive commodity and capital as the forms of value assume in its restless process of expansion, their distinctiveness exists only as a unity in difference, and hence as a contradictory movement full of inconsistencies. Capital circulates in the shape of a constant change of form. Its existence is process. It is the unity of its form. It is the constant change between the form of generality and the form of particularity, of money and of commodity. The foundation of this process is living labor as the substance of value that assumes social existence in and through the circuit of social capital. The transformation of value from one form to the other integrates production and circulation as different moments of one process. Each moment is a result of the presupposition of the other in and through the exploitation of labor. The total movement of capital exists as social capital, within which different capitals exist only as distinct movements of the one process. Difference and unity result in presupposition each other. Hence, the circulation and production are opposites in unity, tearing down the barriers to restless capitalist intercourse. An association of the valorization of value is determining purpose, the driving motive. The social validation of appropriate labor and circulation implies the social comparison of particular capitals in terms of their worth into the dynamic limit of socially necessary labor time expressed in money. Realization of an average rate of profit. Since capitalist production is the social product in private form, the question is how socially isolated private labor is rendered social. This question contains the key to understanding the social processes of value and the measurement of all things in terms of money. Capital exists as individual capital only within the historically dynamic and changing composition of the social processes of value. Appropriation of labor in terms of social labor. Particular capitals are only moments of this process, the mobility of which is made felt to each particular capital in and through the fluidity of money capital. The circuit of money capital is, according to Marx, the most striking and characteristic form of appearance of the circuit of industrial capital. Social capital, as the movement of the social totality value, achieves a real existence in and through the circuit of money capital. The latter is the form in which the social character is manifested to particular capitals. In money capital, the difference of the material existence of the value is obliterated. Money capital expresses the undifferentiated, homogeneous form of value. As such, money capital is the ultimate expression of value. That is an expression of capital's ability to impose work, abstract labor, through the commodity form, exchange value. Hence, money capital is the ultimate expression of the abstraction in action and labor in capitalism. The abstraction in action achieves its most elementary form of existence in the circuit of money capital, M to M prime, as a form which reduces capital to a meaningless condensation. Guess what Marx sum on capital? Without, however, dissolving the existence of a particular capitals. Rather, it imposes upon them the social character of its own existence, while eliminating the relation of labor. At the same time, money capital exists only in and through labor, M to M. The value of money capital is not determined through the value it represents in relation to commodities, but through the surplus value in which it produces for its owner. Hence, the contradiction between labor as substance of value and its obscuration in the circuit of money capital. The incarnation of this process of abstract wealth appearing in money capital's apparent self-valorizing capacity. The constitution of the contradictory unity of value produces in terms of money represents the power of labor as constituents of social form. Money capital is the rational expression of equality, productivity, repression, and thinghood, the characteristics of determination of wealth as social processes of abstract labor. The general interest is precisely the generality of self-seeking interest. Therefore, when economic forms exchange posits the all-sided equality of the subjects and the content, the individual as well as the objective material which strives towards the exchange is freedom. Equality and freedom are thus not only respected in exchange based on the exchange values, but also the exchange of exchange values is the productive, real basis of all equality and freedom. As an expression of equality, money serves as a movement of capital of exchange that constitutes the working class in terms of wage labor. However, the exchange between capital and labor is not just a simple economic exchange on the market. Rather, the wage is not the price of labor as such, but of labor power. The ability to work. That's what Marx says in Wage, Labor, and Capital in Chapter 1 of Capital. The realization of this potential is a process which occurs outside the limits of the market. Hence Marx's vital distinction between labor and labor power. The separation in unity of labor and labor power indicates the contradictory power of money, expressing the equality as a mode of existence of domination. The concept of money displays the contradictions of surplus value production, and at the same time, the ultimate expression of these contradictions is a concrete representation of tilt social reality of class antagonism. Money posits the exclusive form of self-contradictory existence of the category of abstract labor. Money has the advantage of presenting me immediately the lurid face of social relations of value. It shows me value right away as exchange, commanded and organized for exploitation. As a result of the formal equality, money signals the inequality of property relations and represents the formal equality as a relation of domination. Whether money serves as a measure, medium, or exchange of capital, it realizes and represents the social process of value whose existence appears to be constituted by the property of capital and not by the property of labor, as the formative power of social reality. Money as form of value measures the productive power of capital to impose work in a oppressive, nevertheless contradictory way, in the circuit of money capital, as a distinct moment of the circulation of social capital. Capital assumes a reality in which disregards labor as a concrete labor, use value of commodities, inasmuch as the social usefulness of labor is eliminated. Money assumes a mode of existence in the meaningless but elementary form of money capital. Money capital is a capital in its general and elementary form. Capital in general, as distinct from the particular real capitals, is itself a real existence. For example, capital in this general form, although belonging to individual capitalists, in its elementary form as capital, forms a capital which accumulates in the banks or is distributed through them, as Ricardo says so admirably, distributes in accordance to the needs of the production. The self-contradictory social process of value comprises different moments of capital which exist only as distinct in unity from the continuum of forms of abstract labor in the process. Hence, an internal but necessary differentiation of the process. Social reality of class antagonism. Man, this paper's so good. I was really skeptical of this guy because I thought he was an ultra-Luxemburgist. And maybe he is an autonomous. He does keep quoting Negri. But honestly, this paper's really good. Maybe he's just right. The central contradiction in this process is not the contradiction between production and exchange, or between value created, latent value, and value realized as socially necessary labor. The central contradiction in this process is rather constituted in the class relation of capital and labor. The context of the social production of value is composed of the inversion of social production as private production and the realization of the sociality of private production behind the back of private producer. The contradiction between crisis-ridden process of unfettered accumulation, value as process of self-valorization, and the historical limit of capital, as expressed by market constraints upon the realization of value with an average rate of profit, constitutes a constant compulsion to each individual producer to conform to the process of abstract wealth in action, so as to determine the productive power of labor as a movement of expansion of valorization. As a moment of expansive valorization, the compulsion upon each individual capital, if its devaluation is to be avoided, not only to produce, but to increase relative surplus value in the course of accumulation, forces upon each capital the necessity of expelling living labor from the process of production, TPRF, and of attempting us to decrease necessary labor to its utmost. This process relates to the relation between necessary labor and surplus labor, that is, the relation between constitutive parts of the working day and the class relation which constitutes it. Capital exists only in the antithesis to living labor as the substance of abstract labor. The contradiction of social production in the form of capital relates thus to the substance of the social reality of value, the presence of labor within capital. The self-contradictory existence of capital is temporarily normalized through class struggle over the recomposition of the productive forces, and of importance here, through the expansion of production through circulation, the compulsion towards expanded appropriation of homogenization of social reality is a tangential part of capital's own reality, that is, the displacement of production to the world market. At the same time, the mode of existence of the abstract in the concrete reality of the world market is presupposed and premised by the whole process of capitalist reproduction. The most developed form, that is the world market, is directly given to the concept of capital itself. The world market constitutes the presupposition of social reproduction as well as its substratum. The world market posits the most developed mode of existence of abstract labor. The world market constitutes the place in which production is posited as a totality together with all its moments, but within which at the same time all contradiction comes into play. The inversion of social reproduction as production of capital is complete. The world market, as the result of the conceptual displacement of substantive abstraction, transforms into a premise of abstract wealth, a premise which serves as a presupposition for the reproduction of the social relation of production. The world market constitutes a mode of existence of the presence of labor within capital. The conditions of life are thereby subordinated to the richest concrete development of the antagonist tendency of capital and labor. Accordingly, the utmost expansion of the process of abstract wealth founded on exploitation comprises also the expansion of the power of money as a form of value because of the international character of the circuit of money capital within the circuit of social capital situated on the world market. From the conceptual standpoint advocated here, the displacement of the presence of labor within the capital form production of the world market to the world market subordinates the conditions of life to the most richly developed form of the category of abstract labor. Hence, the development of the national economies is subordinate to the equality, repression, ultimately expression of the thinghood of value in the form of the international character of the circuit of money capital. The constitution of the world market turns into a premise of the imposition of the work in national economies. Some implications. The notion of the primacy of class antagonism as the logical historical presupposition, the social condition for the existence of individual capitalists and workers as the basis on which exploitation and political domination rest, make it possible to conceptualize the complexity of the relations between diverse phenomena, notably the relation between the economic and the political. Further, it provides a conceptual tool for analyzing the interconnection of the variety of forms as complementary forms of the existence of the fundamental class relation. The political relations do not primarily correspond to or reproduce economic relations, the so-called functions of the state for capitalist accumulation. Rather, the political components of economics as together different forms of the same fundamental class antagonism. However, the political complements the economic only in the mediated form as a movement moving within the proper motion of class antagonism. The state is not a state in a capitalist society, but rather a movement of the class antagonism of capital and labor. The understanding of the political is thus an analysis of the unity and separation of the different forms assumed by the class antagonism and the process of the working of this antagonism. The thesis of the primacy of class antagonism over the forms assumed by the class relation rejects structuralist and Fordist arguments as sociological studies of different aspects, which do not aim at seeing them as modes of existence of the presence of labor within capital. Contrary to the debates introduced above, the notion of primacy of class antagonism effectively says that the structures do not exist. Of course, in a sense they do exist, but they exist as a modes of existence of class antagonism, and hence as social processes. And not only as social process, but as historical results of the working of a class antagonism, and hence as a historical premise for class struggle. As such, structure exists as things qua reification of human relations. Historically achieved structures of the capitalist state are structures imposed upon capital and the state through the historical development of class struggle, which compelled the state to reconstruct the way in which labor is contained within the context of the expanded reproduction of value. The conceptual understanding of the actual historical process of capitalist social reality need to be conceptualized within context of valorization, that is, of abstract labor in action. This is conceptualization, in turn, inverts the historical precondition of capitalism into a historical result of the precondition of class antagonism. Human anatomy contains a key to the anatomy of the ape. The precondition is the historical becoming of the presence of labor within capital, which is then converted into the premise of capitalist social reality, a premise which in turn exists as a precondition of capital's historical process. The constant and dynamic effort of capital to restructure its control over labor is a precondition of the stability of capitalism, a stability that is based on the reproduction of the historical premise of the capital-labor class relation. The continuity of the presence of labor within the concept of capital exists only as a practical and historical discontinuity. The apparent fragmentation between the political and economic appearance as a relation of things, structures. It is thus part of the fetishization of bourgeois society. The fetishization of the social reality makes it necessary to theorize the interconnection of society, but all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance of the essence of things directly coincided. However, it is these fetishisms which are taken as the starting point in the structural Marxism, including the debate on Fordism. Although the internal relation are concealed, they are understandable to the popular mind. To accept social reality as a whole without insisting on the antagonism which composes it and which processes it is not to grasp distinct moments in their unity, as if this rupture has made its way not from reality into the textbooks, but rather the textbooks into reality, as the tasks were dialectical balancing of the concept and not the grasping of real relations. The abstract materialism of structuralism and its resurrection in the debate on post-Fordism not only reproduces the fetishized forms by way of thinking, it does not move within the object of its thinking, and does not risk the assertion of reality through abstraction, an abstraction which is well within the reality and which exists in practice. Hell yeah. Alright, now because this text is very academic, has a lot of, I don't want to say jargon, but terminology, and because he's describing such a layered phenomena, it can be a bit hard to follow. So I'm going to interject with a condensed summary of this and also some tips on reading things like this. So 1, society is not made up of separate things, but a single contradictory social totality that takes upon many forms. The ultimate essence is class antagonism between capital and labor. This is why all of history hitherto has been the history of class struggle. 2. The economic and political stand to each other as moments of one process. It is not that the economy determines the state, or the state determines the economy, but both are dialectical expressions of the same contradiction. In fact, I would even say, I don't think even saying that they exist like in parallel at all, honestly. I think he's saying that the state is one of many forms that it takes. So that's another point to make. I think I might be not exactly right, but I think he's even breaking away from the kind of Poulantz's and general model people have of you have the economy and then you have the state. I think he's saying that the state is just one of various different forms of mediation, and so they don't exist in this parallel manner. And 3, the entire system is in turn driven by the ultimate contradiction of capitalism. That is, capital exists only in and through labor, but labor is subordinated within capital. This contradiction is the motor of bourgeois society. Things appear separate because they take forms. Form is the way in which the contradictions are reconciled. Wages hide exploitation, money hides labor, and the state appears to be neutral. Capital is a unity of different forms that all express one thing, the contradictory relation between capital and labor. And I will say, for some tips on reading very academic things like this, is the best way is to conceptualize them, is to ask what is the social relation behind this. And in the case for this paper, the answer is going to be class antagonism, ultimately. That's what he's trying to argue. Ultimately what Marx is saying, I believe, which is that class antagonism is the ultimate underlying, if you will, essence of our society, ultimate base, and everything else, even value itself, is ultimately a superstructure upon class antagonism. And that's what he's trying to say. The next layer of what to ask is, what form is it appearing in? That's the other thing he talks about. So that's kind of what he's trying to do with this. The economy hides exploitation, money hides labor, wages hide domination, and the state hides class power. So he's expressing different ways that class antagonism appears. The third layer of what to ask is, what is the contradiction? So everything is expressed as a contradiction. Labor versus capital, necessary labor versus surplus labor, equality versus domination, freedom versus exploitation. The contradiction is expressed as mutual dependence on opposing classes, okay? So you've got to ask, why are these two opposing sides here? The fourth layer, what is being inverted? Okay, so the reality is that labor creates value, but the appearance is the capital appears productive. The determining power of labor appears as the power of capital. Social phenomena do not exist as externally related entities, but as forms of existence of a relation which constitutes them. So it's not that the economy is made up of separate things, but both are expressed as one relation. Again, totality. Totality is the key word for capital. Marx hammers this in the Grundrisse, and Lukács also talks about it. The state and the economy are different ways class struggle shows up. So that means money eliminates the relation to labor. What does that mean? Money makes it look like value comes from money itself, but actually comes from labor. Another form and a way in which contradictions are reconciled. Okay, so that means that social stability is a temporary solution to conflict. Wages make exploitation look fair, and the state stabilizes class conflict. I think that's overall what he's saying in this section. 3. Social constitution and the form or the capitalist state. The historical constitution of abstract labor, as the generality of the social relation of capitalist reproduction, presupposes the historical constitution of the state. The first chapter of Capital presupposes the existence of the state as a historical process and premise for reality of the law of value. The dismantling of feudal restraint is a historical process that establishes social conditions which constitute the reality of value production. The free individual bound by legal restrictions instead of relations of or different coercion. Territorially homogeneous markets, money with a political title. The political protection of the right of property and the provision of infrastructural means within which the law of value can unfold. This formal, but nevertheless real determination of the state comprises in a historical development in which the state arrogated to itself particular functions. The historical development of the state transforms the political revolutionizing of personal relations to domination into the political normalization of bourgeois society. The impartiality of legal standardization of rights reasserts the liberation from feudal constraints within the property motion of capitalist social constitution, individual freedom and equality. In capitalism, the constitution of the general condition within which formal freedom and equality obtain are abstracted in a form distinct from exchange relations and production. The state enforces the norm of social interaction between property owners in a way which safeguards the formal recognition of property right to which each individual is subject. The relation of the state to society implies that private individuals exist as an abstract individuals endowed with standardized rights and as such treated as an abstract citizens. The treatment complements politically the process of classes wage labor. This reasserts of the right of property, denies the existence of class. The form-determined function of the state is something real and is such a legitimacy for the state. These functions cannot be provided by the conscious decisions of the community, since the community exists only in the inverted form of the private individual in a social context characteristic of commodity production. However, behind the sanction of the right of property lies the doubly free laborer, and the concentration of the condition of the means of production and the subsistence in the hands of capital. Behind formal equality and formal freedom lies social reproduction in the form of capital, value production, that is, surplus value production. The formal safeguarding of rights inverts into the substantive guarantees of exploitation, and specifies the state as a moment within the context of the valorization process. The form of the state as social practice inverts hence from achieving the instantiation of human rights, which itself is the right of political emancipation, revolutionizing of direct relations of power, to imposing work as the social reality of the right of property, which itself is a negation of social emancipation. The constitution of social reproduction as reproduction of capital involves the state as a distinct moment of the imposition of value and the organization of life around imposed work. The form of a state which attains generality in terms of the harmonies of formal equality and formal freedom as political domination is hence posited as political organizer of the republic of the market. Formal freedom and equality as modes of existence of exploitation. The political guarantee of the rights of property determines the state as a strong state that imposes rationality and equality of the right of property over society in an attempt to contain the social antagonism of capital and labor by force of law. Therefore, the contradictory unity of surplus value production is displaced to the form of the state in a way which concentrates the social reality of exploitation in and through the guarantee of formal freedom and formal equality of property rights. The social process of formation and implementation of rights in and through the state mediates exploitation in and through the form of rights of property. The social determination of the state as an historic precondition, reality, and process of the social relations of production characterize the state as an illusory community, subsuming particular interest, private and exploitation as universal, social reproduction in the republic of the market as human right. The contradictory unity of surplus value production is mediated as social existence in the form of the state as external, as alienated form of community. This determination of the state in the historical process of capitalist class relations posits at the same time its substantive character as imposing law and order. Instead of privileges, the state sets rights. Instead of relations of will and power, the state sets relations of legality. Instead of despotism, the state concentrates coercion as law and order. Instead of relations of conflict, the state sets contractual relations of social interaction. The concentration of the universal in the form of the state presupposes the state as a concentration of bourgeois society. That quote was great. The constitution of the state involves the displacement of control over the means of production into the form of the state, imposing order in and through legal standardization of formal equal property owners. The social process of wealth as one of value is thus displaced and constituted politically in the form of safeguarding of rights, equality, and freedom upon which the social reality of the process of value rests. That's something great to point out. I mean, the whole point of rights, listen, rights. The problem with rights discourse is ultimately the whole point of rights. The only right that is real, that imbues all the other rights in their ability, is the right of someone to sell their labor, and by consequence to buy commodities, to then having someone to sell their labor to. Every other right, are all downstream of that. They don't come from the military or whatever other liberal nonsense. They come from this. They come from capital accumulation. That's where rights come from. They don't come from nature. They don't come from will of power or whatever the hell. They don't come from the military service, the draft, or something absurd like that. This is what they come from. The concentration of coercive character of bourgeois society in the form of the state guarantees and sanctions the right of property for each commodity owner in a form independent from them. The participation of the political, as distinct from the social, implies that the state can only relate to the coercion so as to impose the existence of the private individual as an abstract citizen within the rule of law. Formal freedom and equality figure not as accomplished fact, but as a process of class antagonism. Yeah, that's what I just said. Formal freedom and equality constitute the historical presupposition of the state, its historic premise and result. The mode of existence of the state inheres in the historical tendency towards expanded social organization of social reproduction in terms of law. The eliminating of social conflict in and through the instantiation of human rights, that is, law and order control. It is here that the process of surplus value production attains generality in the form of political domination. The dynamic unity of surplus value production does not eliminate the antagonism of capital and labor, but pushes continually each mediation of the contradictory unity of surplus value production to its point of supersession, inasmuch as formal equality, but mutually exclusive property rights, constitute relations of exchange as relations of political domination, involving the imposition of relations of legality over class conflict. Therefore, the state exists as a political concentration of social normalization, organization, and domestication of social conflict, in the forms coming to formal rights in the safeguarding of these rights through coercion separated from society and at the same time existing within society. The particularism of the state from society entails specific functions arrogated by the state in the development of capitalism. The historical tendency of statification is presupposed in the substantive abstraction of capital and labor and a result of the concrete historical moment of the abstract tendency of concrete class struggle. The legalization as well as the political subversion of the social relation implies at the same time their stratification, a stratification which aims at the development of the social relation of production in politically supervised, legally controlled, non-conflictual forms. The organization of social conditions through in which the process of value exists is perceived here as the state's content as mode of domination, a content which is presupposed in the determination of the state as historical result, reality and process of capitalist social relations. The separation of the political from the social operates within society, thus the contradiction between forms and content, particularization of the state, imposing the generality of formal freedom and formal equality as community, the content of which is the perpetuation of slavery of labor, the perpetuation that compromises the sine qua non of the existence of capital. The autonomized power of the state entails the form-determined content which puts the state right back into the process of value. Hence, the state is constituted as a contradictory unity of form and content, a unity that is impossible to separate, inasmuch in practice it constitutes a dialectical continuum. The social normalization and pacification of the aspiration of labor in the sphere of social reproduction is beyond the scope of the private contract between capital and labor, and the latter's existence for capital as merely a means of valorization. The social organization of the reproduction of labor, which seeks to harness the power of the working class as a moment of valorization, can only be processed by the state as a distinct moment of the class antagonism between capital and labor, a moment within which the contradictory unity of surplus value production exists as a political relation, complementing the economic. The pacification of class conflict in the forms of labor and order caused regarding the regulation of the working day, capital, at last to be bound by the chains of legal regulation. I want to interject real quick, so sometimes you see me stop. Technically, it's like I'm going to the next line. I don't know if it's a translation thing, or because this was obvious. If you can see how this article is on the website, you should be reading along for an article like this. There's a lot of formatting little things. I don't know, it's like some of the sentence structures, they don't seem right. Like some of the periods I think should be commas. And this is like order cause regarding, I don't know, this might be a correct sentence, but it doesn't sound correct, basically. And that's why sometimes you throughout this you saw me stop. I actually didn't lose my place. I'm just like, are you sure this is correct? I don't know. Anyways, I don't know if it's a translation thing or what. The pacification of class conflict in the forms of law and order caused regarding the regulation of the working day, capital at last can be bound by the chains of legal regulation. The displacement of the contradictory unity of surplus value production and its mode of existence as formal freedom and equality to the state specifies the state as a moment of the social relations of production that preserves the conditions of capital's existence, living labor. This preservation of living labor, both in terms of the existence of the working class and the normalization of the aspiration of the working class within the limits of value, is abstracted from capital as individual capital and conforms to the state's constitution as a mode of existence of the social relation of capital and labor. The legal chain of regulation thus exposes capital's general need as social relation for living labor opposed to capital in its real existence as individual capital. Capital cannot exist without the state. The form of the state is thus to be seen as a distinct mode of existence of exploitation, and the state in that the state internalizes its historic development to the preservation of the substance of value, living labor. The state mediates capital's dependence on the reproduction of labor power within the limits of capital. The state attains historic existence in the dialectical process of these functions arrogated by the state. The development of the state needs to be seen as one in which the contradictory unity of surplus value production is processed in the political form as a moment of the same process of class struggle, social reproduction as in against domination. That's an interesting observation. He's kind of saying like, it's like, M to M prime? It's kind of like state to state prime, is kind of what he's saying. I mean, it's not exactly, because obviously the state doesn't, accumulate. Well, it kind of does. It kind of does, actually. At least bureaucratized and legally, it does. I don't know. He probably could have wrote it out like that. Maybe it wouldn't be professional, but it's kind of like state to state prime. The tendency of the state to arrogate itself functions of organizing labor power, such as housing, education, skills, health, social reproduction, discipline, living conditions, legal provisions, enforcement of legal rights, organization of free time. I don't know if we need that much examples. And likewise, the processing of the aspiration of the working class within historical limits of capital and the state is restricted by the state's own precondition, surplus value production and the domination of capital. The state is a mode of existence of labor in capitalism. The statist moderation of the perpetuation of the power of capital and the slavery of labor posits the state in regards to labor as an instance of oppression and at the same time an instance of its existence in capitalism. The state provides things we need, but in the form that is oppressive, as it denies and disorganizes by use of force in the name of citizenship, social emancipation, in contrast to political emancipation, characterizes capitalist domination. That's what a lot of people get hung up on. They're like, so I was talking to someone earlier today, and she was arguing like, I don't know, the state guarantees trans rights or something, which is, by the way, in 2026, I don't know why you're still saying that. It's 2026, wake up. But it's like, that's like the whole point. That's the whole illusion of the bourgeois state. That's like the entire point of it, It's to give the appearance that it's preserving these rights. Okay, but these rights can exist without the state. The state guarantees these rights in air quotes, but it does so in a way that is oppressive. It's the Benjamin Franklin quote. It's kind of actually true here. Actually, Marx was influenced by Benjamin Franklin to an extent, apparently. At least liked him. That's kind of a tangent, but anyways, the contradiction exists not as a accomplished fact, but as a process of class struggle. Therefore, it is not sufficient simply to indicate the class character of the state. Rather, the class character needs to be analyzed as a specific form and praxis of class domination, and as such open to the class struggle itself. The attempt of the state and capital to harness class conflict in the bourgeois forms of legality and to confine the aspiration of the working class to the limits of the state and capital implies not only the legalization of social relations, it implies also the recognition of the aspiration of the working class in the processing of the latter's aspiration in a way that denies the existence of the working class as class by processing its struggle through the forms of abstract citizenship. The state is thus to be conceived of as a concentration of the coercive character of capitalist society, both as its historical presupposition and its historical premise and result. The historical composition of the state during fascism cannot be seen as an exceptional form of the state, nor can the so-called re-authoritarianism of the state during the crisis of Fordism and the strengthening of the authoritarian character of state in post-Fordism be seen as a qualitatively new period of capitalism. Oh, that's a good one. That's a good line. Rather, the coercive character of the state exists as presupposition, premise and result of the social reproduction of the class antagonism, and not as an exceptional form of the state or as a qualitatively new period of capitalist development. The historical determination and composition of the form of state as the concentrated and organized form of society is a process of class conflict, entailing the political attempt to sustain and reassert control over labor. In the face of the difficulty of the periodization specific historical forms of capitalist development, the attempt to contrast specific forms of political violence to the phase of a seemingly civilized use of political power disregards the general character of the form of the capitalist state. The sociology of different types of capitalist modes of production, as in Poulan's in the debate on post-Fordism, entail an essentialism of specific aspects or functions arrogated by the state to itself in the course of the class struggle. The question about the authoritarian character of the state and its historical concrete role vis-a-vis the social concerns in the composition / over decomposition of the historical presupposition of the state as a premise of the social conflict. The republic of the market preemptively stabilizing the process of value through the corrective repression of the aspiration of labor attains generality in the state's preemptive counter-revolutionary, that is, in the reimposition of value form over the conditions of life. The relative latency of the terrorist use of force involves the imposition of the historical premise of the state's own constitution, that is, capitalist domination, against the presence of real possibilities of labor's indiscipline, social unrest, and the strength of the working class as manifested in commanding living standards incompatible with accumulation. The use of force entails the safeguarding of social reproduction in the form of capital by maintaining the peaceful, civilized form, legal and democratic form of the appearance of bourgeois society. The development of the form of the state is neither a reflection of the political and ideological changes, nor merely a result of the economic crises, but a mode of motion of the self-contradictory form of the capitalist state, in the face of the crisis-ridden development of accumulation, and as such a process of the constituting power of labor within capital. The limits of capital are at the same time limits of the state. The presence of labor within capital, the activity of the state are bound up and structured by this precondition, the reproduction of capital relations of its own existence, by the need to ensure, or attempt to ensure, the continued accumulation of capital. This domination does not have to be theorized anew at the level of the state, since the powers the state arrogated during the historical development of capitalism are already inserted in a particular society, and since it already exists as the historical precondition of social reality as a whole. Seeing the state as a mode of existence of the presence of labor within capital implies the state cannot be understood as an agent of capital. The state cannot provide general conditions suitable to every particular capital beyond the guarantee of the reproduction of the social form of social reproduction, because each capital exists only in relation to each other as a moment of a single process that constitutes it. Social capital exists as a process of difference and unity with the capitalist life cycle of value. For capitalist reproduction to take on the form of overaccumulation and crisis, each individual capital must be involved as a moment of the social process of value in terms of negation, or devaluation, and affirmation, or average rate of profit. The state and capital depend on the continuous reproduction of the transformation of value as a particularity and universality mediated by the composed within the circuit of social capital. Therefore, one cannot derive the historical development of the state from the specific interest served by particular policies, as for instance implied by Jessop's reference to hegemonic interests of different capital logicians. Rather, the form of the state needs to be seen as a mode of existence of the class relation which constitutes and suffuses the circuit of capital. Consequently, the form of the state attains existence as the political mode of existence of the abstract category of labor in action. In turn, the constitution of the state is displaced to the world market as the concentration of the richest concrete development of the constitution of power of labor within capital. The mode of motion of the state within the context of valorization needs to be seen within the context of the world market if the interconnection between the economic and political is to be understood in its material constitution as distinct in unity. In the debate on the post-Fordist state, the world market is perceived as a power that dictates state policies and coerces the state to reconstruct a historical form of existence. To be sure, the world market dictates, but its existence is not power as such, but the constitution of the contradictory unity of surplus value production. That's an interesting concept. The so-called dictates of the world market are the dictates of the crisis-ridden development of accumulation that obtain only in and through labor. The dictates of the world market amounted to displacement of the class contradictions of the conflict between necessary and surplus labor to the constitution of the same contradiction within the form of the world market. The form of the market is a moment subaltern to the international movement of capital, that is, to the richest possible concrete development of the substantive abstraction of class antagonism. The state is constituted within the proper motion of the mode of existence of social capital operating internationally. The world market constitutes a mode of existence of the contradiction of social reproduction. Global concentration and capitalist accumulation, that is the negation and affirmation of appropriated labor. Each national economy can only be conceptualized adequately as a specific international and at the same time integral part of the world market. The national state can only be seen in this dimension. The conceptual and practical movement of the class antagonism of capital and labor contains a further displacement of the contradictory unity of surplus value production. Money capital, as the ultimate expression of value, expands its mobility into the utmost possible space of the world market. The contradiction involves in the consistence and sequence of different value forms composed within the process of social capital is the potential autonomization of monetary from productive accumulation concentrated on the world market. The autonomization involves the displacement of the contradictory unity of the production process, that is, labor and valorization process, to the constitution of the same contradiction in the form of the contradiction between the production and loanable capital, that is, the contradiction between the factory and credit system. This process is mainly constituted through the development of the credit system, in which money no longer functions as a hoard but as capital, though not in the hands of its proprietors, but rather of other capitalists, at whose disposal it is put. The self-contradictory character of capital assumes an apparent independent form and interest as a relation between the owner of money capital and the manager of production. This displacement of the contradictory unity of surplus value seemingly eliminates the relation of interest profit to surplus value. However, interest profit exists only as a mode of existence of surplus value. Hence, social reality is constituted as a movement of contradiction in and through labor, a movement in which the contradictory unity of surplus value production reasserts itself at M to N prime, the meaningless form of capital, the preservation and objectivation of production relations in their highest degree, the interest-bearing form, the simple form of capital in which antecedents its own process of reproduction. That was all one sentence. Holy shit. That anytime you see, by the way, the movement of contradiction in and through, just read it as dialectical. That's all that means. Productive accumulation has to succeed in order for money capital to be sustained, while the failure to turn credit into productive command over labor reasserts for productive capital the limits of the market to realize capital profitability in the form of insolvency and bankruptcy. At the same time, the default of productive activity threatens to bring about a collapse of the credit relations upon which social relations rest. In order to sustain the most elementary, via meaningless form of capital, labor and productive capital needs to be sacrificed so as to make it possible for banks to absorb heavy losses without default, while the sacrificing of surplus value production on the altar of money destroys the basis in and through which meaningless forms of capital exist. The unity of monetary and productive accumulation reasserts itself in and through their destructive separation. The subordination of the contradictory existence of the production process, labor and valorization process, to the supremacy of money displaces as a form of class struggle the contradictory existence, the production process into contradiction between credit and functioning capital. This displacement of the contradictory unity of surplus value production is indifferent in terms of social command, as it is form of wealth. It's meaningless in content, use value production. None other than the uncoupling of valorization from the labor process. Within the crisis-ridden development of accumulation, the development of the capitalist state is processed in immediate form through social unrest and in mediated form through monetary constraints. Basic for the development of the state is the social conflict over the imposition of the value form upon the conditions of life. but it is through the power of money, as a form of value, that the imperatives of capitalist social reproduction make themselves felt to the state. The displacement of the antagonism of capital and labor in the form of monetary pressure involves the state because the state's responsibility for national currency, state as central bankers. Seeing the relation between money, capital, and the state as a relation in which the contradictory unity of surplus value production makes itself felt by the state in a mediated form indicates the material discontinuity of the real process of class antagonism, erosion of tax base, balance of payment problems, and the accumulation of public debt that exists as claim upon certain proportion of tax revenue. These pressure indicate the reassertion of the contradictory unity of surplus value production over the form of the capitalist state in and through the abstract average of the money power of capital. In order to understand the working of the money power of capital, one has to descend from the monetary image of crisis to an analysis of the crisis of social relations, from the crisis of circulation to the crisis of the relation between necessary and surplus labor. The antagonistic tendency of the class struggle is concentrated in the power of money as the incarnation of value in which the substance of its own existence is seemingly eliminated. In order to avert collapse of credit, the sacrifice of productive activity and labor on the altar of money involves fundamentally the reimposition of the power of money over the conditions of life. This reimposition involves the state in imposing the generality of social existence, value production, over the social and through the elementary form of capital. In this process, the self-contradictory form of the state attains generality as the harmony's last refuge. Harmonies of the formal equality and formal freedom upon which the historical constitution of the state rests. The state as the harmony's last refuge represents thus communal interest, imposing the lurid face of the equality in the form of money over society. The state attains existence as the collective representation of money in command. The subordination of the conditions of life to money scarcity, involving law and order control, its precondition, premise, and result. The development of the state, as represented by monetarism, is presupposed in the substance abstraction of bourgeois society, a presupposition which now serves as a premise for class struggle. Conclusion. The article has aimed to show that the relation between structure and struggle is an internal one. The attempt to understand social reality in its proper motion demystifies structures by viewing them as historical forms of existence of class antagonism, and so as forms in through which class antagonism exists. History is the history of class struggle, as Marx declares in the Communist Manifesto. However, as he adds in the 18th Brumaire, under conditions imposed on human activity, through the results of former struggle, which serves as a premise as a new basis for the struggle itself. Consequently, objective laws of capitalism are to be discussed as forms through which and in which class antagonism exists in capitalist society. In the event, so to speak, about objective laws implies the fetishistic reification of social relations as relations of things, it is impossible to make a contrast between laws of capitalist development and class antagonism without falling into precisely the fetishism Marx criticizes in Capital. That's very good. That's very smart. This articulation of structure and struggle separates what belongs together as inner nature or as actual and alive. To make a contrast between the unfolding of objective laws and class struggle is to see the crisis of social reproduction and its resolution as an inevitable process of what is seen as a structural disintegration or integration of a corresponding relation between economic and political subsystems. The understanding of struggle as an effect of the unfolding of objective laws of development posits the inevitability of crisis and/or recovery, and rejecting, by implication, the Marxist understanding of history as one of class struggle. Such reasoning is teleological because crisis is seen as a transitory period in which the unfolding of objective laws of capitalist development defines the emergence of a new mode of domination and appropriates to a new corresponding regime of accumulation. The role of class struggle is strictly limited within this framework. Conceptualizing the capitalist state as a form of social relation, as one has to reject Jessup and Hirsch's notion of the relation of structure and struggle. An understanding of the state as a movement of social contradiction rejects a structuralist conceptualization of different phenomena in terms of structural adequacy. Once the state is no longer seen as the political form of class antagonism, complex historical phenomena can indeed only be analyzed as a complex resultant of multiple determinations. When social form is understood otherwise than as a mode of existence of the social relation of production, one is left with desystematizing these relations into economic relations, while the political relations have to be theorized in relation to the economic as relatively, if not radically, autonomous from the economic. The constitution of social reality in Jessup follows the independent logics of political and ideological domains, forcing the scientific mind to follow, in descriptive terms, the strategic line of capital in the face of various dilemmas, risk, uncertainties, and complexities, emergent strategies, trial and error technique, etc. Such class relations are reduced to 1. Strategic mechanism, cause amongst others, relations in production. The material world of capitalism emerges as a systemic cause of the struggle between different logicians determined by allocation interest. This understanding rests on seeing social reality as determined by combination of structural development and individualized subjectivity. Once class antagonism ceases to be considered as the primary mechanism, the social antagonism of capital and labor appears as a pluralism of contesting social forces. The consequence of Jessup's equation of the capitalist strategy with class struggle is the dismissal of an understanding of history as a history of class struggle. Hostile to form analysis, while proclaiming in its favor, Jessup acknowledges merely structural conditions. The constituting power of labor, as the abstraction of social reality in action, is thereby dismissed. An understanding of the contraction internal to domination is pushed into oblivion. Instead, one has to embark on an individualistic analysis of effect and result, the ontological depth of which is the theoretical capacity to penetrate beneath the actual course of events into more fundamental mechanism and causal powers which generate these events in specific circumstances. Consequently, Thatcherism can be approached best by a polytheist approach, because there are many multiple causes and effects and hence many Thatcherisms. Such a conceptualization of social reality carries with it the danger that is in the end tautological. First of all, the outward appearance of reality is taken for granted, multiple causes, and then it is in the light of this outward appearance of reality that social development is assessed. The question for Marx was not how to understand multiple determinations and causes and effects in their interpretation, to take the outward appearance of reality as the conceptual starting point, multiple causes as in Jessup, disarticulation of structures and struggles as in Hirsch, without insisting on the social relations that constitute social reality, run the risk of finishing up the conceptually where the theorizing of the critique of political economy starts. Okay, to wrap up, the first chapter of Capital presupposes the existence of the state as premise for the reality of the law of value. Capital accumulation is only made possible by the state. It exists as a historical necessity for this process. Okay, the state presents society as a world of equals, enforcing norms and safeguarding the formal recognition of property right. But this treatment as abstract citizens complements the processing of classes as wage labor in order to make class relations appear as relations between equals. For more on that, see on the Jewish question. The state is a moment within the context of the valorization process. It is not an entity unto itself, but rather a moment of the class antagonism of capital and labor. The state exists as the organization and domestication of social conflict in forms conforming to formal rights, and recall that form is the way in which contradictions are reconciled. Law was therefore a controlled expression of class struggle. The state is an illusory community, subsuming particular interests is universal. Society is divided along class antagonisms, but appears unified. Forms like citizenship and nation. In this manner, the state represents unity while reproducing division. Behind formal equality and formal freedom always lies surplus value production, and the formal safeguarding of rights inverts into the substantive guarantee of exploitation. The form is equality and rights, the content is exploitation and domination. This is what it means for the state to be constituted as a contradictory unity of form and content in a dialectical continuum. The state provides things we need, but in a form that is oppressive. The development of the state itself is a process of class conflict and is constantly reshaped by such conflict. The state cannot be understood as agent of capital. It is a form that is a mode of existence of the class relation. The totality of capitalism is the appearance. Class conflict is the essence. That's my summary, basically, of this last section here. Yeah, this is pretty good, because I honestly always did consider the state basically an entity, almost. But what this is saying is not really an entity at all. It's a multifaceted part of, it's a multifaceted face within the totality of capitalism. And it's not part of the, the appearance. It's not part of the it's certainly part of the appearance. The only essence is class conflict. Yeah, really good. I'm gonna do actually his two others essays I found in the state, and then I'm going to do his stuff on money after that.